At the end of last week, we saw how, in the conclusion of the book of Judges, the story of God and Israel seems to have got a bit stuck. Israel has become as bad, if not worse, than the surrounding nations. Israelites are killing fellow Israelites in quite a brutal manner. And the question we left with, well, what is God going to do? And the answer comes, and the beginning of the solution, we might say, comes in a very short story, in a very short book, set not in the political world or the world even of the judges and the great leaders, but in a rather mundane story tied up with issues of agriculture, famine, and inheritance. And that's the story of the book of Ruth.
In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband.
The story starts by telling us it takes place in the days when the judges ruled. Now, the story itself isn't more specific. Some people have tried to sort of do mathematical calculations from generations and have suggested that it takes place in the earlier parts of the book of Judges, the days of Ehud or Deborah or somewhere around there. But it seems that the book is deliberately vague because it wants to tie us up perhaps to the general context of the book of Judges, that sort of chaos and the problems that we saw in the last book and would have been fresh in the mind of many readers. And we're told that a famine took place. Now, famines were common in the ancient world, but in the context of the book of Judges, it might suggest that this is a period when Israel had abandoned God and fallen out of his favor. And we're told that a man went from Bethlehem, and there's an irony here because Bethlehem means the house of bread, and things have got so bad that there's famine in the house of bread, and he goes to Moab. Now, in the ancient world, people often moved these shorter distances in times of trouble. We read that later in the book of Samuel, how David's family will take refuge in Moab when he's persecuted by Saul. So it's a grey area whether by going to Moab, if this man was showing a lack of faith or disobeying God. What is perhaps interesting is that this man is known as Elimelech. God is my king. And yet we've been told that this is at a time when Israel had no king. Everyone did as he saw fit, and Elimelech saw fit to go with his family and stay in Moab. We're told that he died and left his wife as a widow probably goes too far to suggest this is God's punishment. Men dying what we would consider relatively young is was very common in the ancient world, and his sons take Moabite wives after his death. Now, this is a grey area. There's no explicit condemnation of marrying Moabite women in Old Testament law, but it is implied by the way in the book of Numbers, Moabite women led the Israelites astray, and later on the idea that because Moab did not allow Israel passage into the promised land, there was an exclusion from Moabites from participating in the assembly. And there may be the idea that these men are turning their back on their people and now looking to settle in Moab and remain there. What we realize is that these marriages were unfruitful. They did not conceive, their wives did not give them heirs. And then these men die and they leave Naomi in a very vulnerable state because now she has no male to look after her in what was a very patriarchal, male oriented society.
When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. With her 2 daughters-in-law she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness, as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons? Who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go I will go, and where you stay I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God my God. Where you die I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. So the 2 women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi," she told them. "Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." So Naomi returned from Moab accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as the barley harvest was beginning.
Widowed, having lost her sons and with no grandchildren, Naomi realizes there's nothing left for her in Moab, and hearing that God has blessed the people of Israel and provided food for them, it looks as if this is one of those moments when they're being ruled by good judges. She chooses to return to Bethlehem, and initially her daughters-in-law come with her, which itself is an unusual decision. But Naomi, moved by compassion, realizes that there's nothing for these Moabite widows in Israel and urges them to return to their families who can care for them and provide for them. And there's no recrimination towards Orpah. There's no idea that she's done anything wrong. In fact, she has gone beyond her duty to her mother-in-law, and being released is well in her rights to return to her own family. What is surprising is the gesture of Ruth in insisting of going with her mother-in-law to her mother-in-law's land, where she would be in a very vulnerable position. One of the interesting things I would like to draw out in this passage is Naomi's rather honest, if ambiguous, relationship with God. In her words to her daughter-in-laws, we see still her allegiance to God. In fact, her prayer is that the Lord, Yahweh, will show kindness to you, that the Lord will grant favor and rest to them. So Naomi sees God as a source of favor and blessing, but at the same time, she claims that this Lord's hand has gone out against her. In fact, we see her later on when she arrives back in Bethlehem, asking for her name to be changed from Naomi, which means pleasant, to Mara, which means bitter, because from her perspective, the Lord has made her life bitter. The Lord has afflicted her. The Lord has brought misfortune upon her. If we consider the fact that she has lost her husband, lost her sons, we can see where she's coming from. In fact, the 10 years of suffering seem to have been so intense that when she arrives in the town of Bethlehem, which in our minds is probably a small village, and you can imagine her coming through the gates into the village square and everyone looking at her, and people almost struggling to recognize them, ask themselves, no, can this be Naomi? And so the chapter ends with this rather odd pair turning up at Bethlehem, a bitter, wounded Israelite woman, and Ruth, who not only has turned towards her mother, but her mother-in-law, but despite perhaps all that has gone on, she has turned towards her mother-in-law's God. She says, your people will be my people, and your God, my God. And it's interesting that she starts to address God by Yahweh, the Lord, may the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. And in the midst of all of Naomi's pain, something about the truth and the light of the one true God has drawn Ruth in.
Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, who does that young woman belong to? The overseer replied, she is the Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters. She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. So Boaz said to Ruth, my daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Boaz replied, I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord, she said. You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants. At mealtime Boaz said to her, "Come over here. Have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him." Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished. And she lived with her mother-in-law.
This part of the story starts with the narrator informing us that Naomi had a wealthy relative, a man of standing called Boaz, and that immediately raises a question: why hasn't he done more to help them? In fact, later on, he's going to be identified as one of their kinsman redeemer. Why has he not redeemed them? And our narrator will withhold the explanation until the next chapter. As Ruth goes out into the fields, we see two things here which remind us that things are perhaps not well in Israel, even though it is a time of prosperity. First is Ruth's expectation that she will need to find favor of the landowners and the farmers to be able to collect leftover grain. And in fact, we see her asking permission to do that. Well, according to the law, that should not be necessary. After all, the gleanings were destined precisely for people like Naomi and Ruth, widows with no male to to care for them. So in a sense, it's worrying that Ruth needs to ask permission for something which would be her right. Also, if we remember how the book of Judges ended, there is a sense that Israel is not a safe place for women. And we have this in the background in a story here, especially Boaz is concerned that Ruth stay in his fields, and he has to make an explicit command to his workers not to touch her, not to harass and molest her. And so, a sense, it's almost God's invisible hand in his providence, although he's not actually mentioned explicitly as guiding Ruth, but she is led to the field of someone she does not know who he is, that he is one of their relatives, and someone who will ensure that she is kept safe and cared for. We see a lot in this chapter about the character of Ruth. Her concern for Naomi and her mother-in-law has become actually a topic within the village, and Boaz has heard in the village through other people what she has done for her mother-in-law, although he hasn't met her personally until now. He has heard of her reputation. And we see that she is a hard worker. Even strong and sturdy foremen and other workers have noticed that she has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter. We also have insights into Boaz's character. He not only is someone who will allow Ruth to have what the law provides, he actually goes beyond what the law provides. He invites her to sit down with the other workers and eat alongside them. And he, in fact, serves her himself. And he actually gives orders to actually allow her, although the law only allowed the poor to pick up what had been left behind, he lets her go among the stalks, and he actually encourages his workers to drop a few more behind so that she can pick them up without actually feeling as if she was begging. It's quite an interesting, he sort of hides his generosity. And the interesting thing is that as a consequence of Ruth's work, hard work, and Boaz's generosity, by the end of the day, Ruth has collected enough to feed her and Naomi and look after them for several weeks. And for Naomi, this is suddenly the first time she realized that maybe her fortunes are starting to change. That, God has led her daughter-in-law to the right person, to the right field, and she, realizing that it is a family and it is a kinsman redeemer, she urges Ruth to take this further.
One day Ruth's mother-in-law Naomi said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you, where you will be well provided for. Now Boaz, with whose women you have worked, is a relative of ours. Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do." "I will do whatever you say," Ruth answered. So she went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet and lay down. In the middle of the night something startled the man. He turned, and there was a woman lying at his feet. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for you all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true that I am a guardian redeemer of our family, there is another who is more closely related than I. Stay here for the night, and in the morning if he wants to do his duty as your guardian redeemer, good, let him redeem you. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives I will do it. Lie here until morning." So she lay at his feet until morning, but got up before anyone could be recognized, and he said, "No one must know that a woman came to the threshing floor." He also said, "Bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out." When she did so, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and placed the bundle on her. Then he went back to town. When Ruth came to her mother-in-law, Naomi asked, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me these 6 measures of barley, saying, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, "Wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens. For the man will not rest until the matter is settled today."
Naomi is not content simply to live off Ruth's hard work. And as time goes by, we see Naomi becoming concerned. But what can she do to ensure that Ruth is looked after even after Naomi dies? And she comes up with what we might call a rather high risk plan, because she sends Ruth out in the evening, in the night, and sort of dressing herself up and perfumed herself up, and to really go to Boaz and sort of basically wake him up in the middle of the night. Now, this is a high risk strategy. In the worst case scenario, Ruth is at danger of being taken advantage of by Boaz and even being raped or abused by him and his workers, as we've seen these kind of things that have been going on in Israel from the book of Judges. Even if none of that happens, there's a danger that Boaz might take this the wrong way and seek to expose Ruth as an immoral woman or as a prostitute. So it's rather quite a high risk strategy. And Ruth, nonetheless, does what her mother-in-law does and obeys it. And it's interesting in her request when she identifies herself to Boaz, says, "I am your servant, Ruth. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are my kinsman redeemer." This is, in a sense, he's actually repeating back to Boaz the blessing that he had sought to bless you, is when he says, "No, may the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." In the Hebrew, the image of wings and being covered is the same. And so, in a sense, Ruth is saying to Boaz, "No, you're the one who God is calling to do what you have asked him to do." And Boaz responds with much dignity. It's interesting his comment that the kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. That could be simply interpreted as sort of the older man flattered because a younger woman has shown attention to him. But there's an interesting dimension here, is that in chasing after other men, Ruth might have been catering for her future, finding herself a husband. But in going for the kinsman redeemer, she's actually ensuring that Naomi will be looked after. And not just that, even the family line of Elimelech and her own previous husband being preserved. In a sense, she's also being revealed as righteousness. And now we have explained why Boaz hasn't done more before. There's actually someone ahead of him in the line. There's a closer relative who has the rights and duties of the kinsman redeemer. And in a sense, they have first call. And so Boaz is determined to do things properly, and he's going to sort it out quickly. The idea is that the day will not be over before it's done, but he still wants to ensure that Ruth is cared for, both in her reputation, and it's possibly a command to himself, to her, that let's do this so that they won't be known that a woman came here. It may also be a command to his servants that word should not get round. And then, of course, he sends Ruth back with a generous provision of barley.
Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. And he said, I will redeem it. Then Boaz said, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman, who is coming into your house, like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily in Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem, and may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman.
And so the story draws to a close with what might surprise us, a business transaction, part of what the culture of those days was like. And it's interesting, the track that Boaz takes, it doesn't start with Ruth. He starts with the land. This is land which would have belonged to Elimelech, which would have fallen out of the family hands when he left, and all the problems they went through. And so one of the tasks of the kinsman redeemer was to redeem land. So the task is to buy and purchase the land so that it returns to the clan and to the family of Elimelech. And the kinsman redeemer is initially very positive about this because he probably sees this as a good investment, a way of increasing his land portfolio. So he's willing to buy it. This is when Boaz introduces the fact that therefore by buying the land, the kinsman redeemer takes on responsibility for the widow, for Ruth, for providing an heir for Elimelech, and incorporating her into the family. And this is when he steps back and he doesn't want to do it, probably because in investing in the land, he would invest in something which would not benefit his own sons, his own current descendants, but would belong to the Elimelech's family and his descendants. And he's not willing to take this financial hit, as it were, so he steps back, which is then when Boaz steps in. He's willing to take on perhaps the financial implications of marrying Ruth, and it's in quite a picturesque way. It's done with one person taking off the sandal and handing it over. So in a sense, by handing over his sandal to Boaz, the kinsman redeemer is saying, well, now the field becomes your responsibility, as does Ruth. And it's probably not the most romantic ways of expressing it, but it is how it was in those days. Boaz therefore sort of declares in front of the elders as his witnesses that he has purchased the land and the widow which comes with it.
So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went in to her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron, Hezron fathered Ram, Ram fathered Amminadab, Amminadab fathered Nahshon, Nahshon fathered Salmon, Salmon fathered Boaz, Boaz fathered Obed, Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David.
The practice of a kinsman redeemer marrying a widow to provide an heir is often described as a Levirate marriage. And we're told here that Ruth gave birth to a son, but considering how she had been married 10 years to Mahlon and hadn't managed to conceive, this was by no means guaranteed, and the narrator attributes this to God's intervention. The Lord enabled her to conceive. And it's interesting how now the action and the focus shifts back to Naomi and the one who had considered her life bitter, the one who considered that the hand of the Almighty was against her. She's celebrated within Bethlehem as someone upon whom God's favor has rest, who because of Ruth and Ruth's love and faithfulness, and who was better than 7 sons, now has someone to renew her and sustain her. And we see how Naomi actually cares for the child and how her fortunes are reversed. And so the story ends with a genealogy. And a genealogy has some significant names. We have the name of Perez, who was the son of a descendant of Judah, who in a sense is significant because he also emerged through the story of Tamar as consequence of a Levirate practice. We also have the name of Solomon, who from the New Testament we also discover was married to Rahab, the prostitute, who spared the spies in Jericho. And then we have, of course, the figure of David, the great king. And if Judges ends with this declaration that in those days Israel had no king, every man did as he saw fit, in the book of Ruth, we see God working behind the scenes, preparing the way for the coming of the king according to his own heart. How does this book of Ruth fit into this story of God that we have been tracing through the Old Testament? On one hand, it might seem a pretty unremarkable story. You could have a strapline young widow goes to the field and finds a husband. It seems more the stuff of a sort of mid-afternoon romantic comedy than anything particularly profound. Perhaps if we were being a bit more spiritual in our focus, we might say focus on how a bitter Israelite widow finds her faith renewed through the faithfulness of her daughter-in-law. Again, not perhaps the most spectacular storyline, and if we trace through Ruth, we don't see many miracles taking place or spectacular things. It's just the world of everyday life, trying to get a living, working in the fields, business deals, marriage. And yet, if in the book of Judges, the story seems to have got stuck, Israel has become unfaithful, as bad as the nations. Here we actually see God at work providing a solution, God at work behind the scenes through the ancestors of David, and of course, through David, we have that line which traces until Jesus, and perhaps the faithful and the good characters of Ruth, Boaz, and in her own way, Naomi, require more investigation and perhaps justify a closer look. After all, I think it can be said that actually Ruth, in her faithfulness, is actually more consequential in a story of salvation than Samson was with all his might and power. And the book of Ruth reminds us that in unspectacular ways, unremarkable, almost invisible to the human eye, God was still at work through faithful people so that the descendants of Abraham and Abraham's descendant, Jesus, might be the means of blessing for all the nations.